Welcome to Scary Mary. Find a quiet place, get comfortable, and let your body begin to unwind. Here, true crime stories are told softly to help you drift between fear and calm. These are scary stories for brave dreams. If you enjoy this dark kind of piece, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. If fear had handwriting, this is exactly what it would look like. Clear, even lines, neat symbols drawn by a hand that knows no tremble. If a nightmare had a voice, it would sound exactly like this calm, almost matter-of-fact, reporting a double murder like tomorrow's weather. This is not just a story about crimes. It is a story about a dialogue with emptiness, about a monologue that lasted for decades. This is the story of a man who didn't just take lives. He stole peace. He wove threads of fear into the very fabric of reality, turning the sunny streets of California into a stage for his personal theater of horror. And this theater had only one actor, director, and playwright. His name invented, chosen from a newspaper's horoscope column, became a synonym for impunity. Zodiac. But to understand the scale of this phenomenon, this shadow cast upon an entire era, we must not start with him. We must start with the world in which he appeared, with America of the late 1960s. It was a time of fracture. A whole generation, raised in post-war prosperity, suddenly saw the ideal cracking. The Vietnam War was splitting the country into two camps. The 1967 Summer of Love in San Francisco, with its slogans of peace and harmony, had already burned out, leaving behind a hangover and a slight aftertaste of cynicism. There was a sense of an end in the air, the end of an era of innocence. And at this very moment, in this perfect cultural vacuum, its antithesis is born. Not chaos, but cold, calculated, orderly chaos. Not protest, but a mockery of human life itself. He became the dark double of his era. If the hippies preached love, he professed absolute hatred. If society was obsessed with soul-searching and the search for meaning, he offered the only meaning, senseless murder. He was a product of his time, its dark reflection in a distorted mirror. And his first note in this symphony of destruction sounded in a quiet, unremarkable suburb, on a deserted road where teenagers went on dates to dream about the future. He came there precisely to take that future away. December 20, 1968. Vallejo, California. Not an industrial giant, but rather a bedroom suburb of San Francisco. A town for families where people knew their neighbors by sight and believed in the safety of their streets. The weather was cold, humid for California, and the fog, as often happens, had already begun to creep over the hills, enveloping the lights of the houses. On such an evening, 17-year-old David Faraday took his girlfriend, 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen, for a ride. They weren't just a couple on a date. They were part of that very American dream that hung in the air. David, a serious, smart guy, an honors student with brilliant prospects, he was fascinated by radio electronics, the world of transistors and circuits, a world built on logic and order. Betty Lou, a modest, sweet girl, just beginning to discover life, that evening, they were most likely listening to the Beatles or the Rolling Stones on the radio. Songs about love, freedom, and hope. Their destination was like Herman Road, a winding, sparsely populated road leading to an abandoned shooting range for their parents' generation. Such places were symbols of romance and solitude. For someone else, they were the perfect hunting ground. Around 10:15 p.m., they parked their light blue Rambler on a gravel lot. They didn't even suspect they had become the object of surveillance, that their lights, alone in the night, had become a beacon, attracting a predator. Modern profilers suggest that Zodiac may have been patrolling such places for a long time, studying the habits of his future victims, enjoying the feeling of control and anticipation. What did they feel in the last seconds? Did they hear the crunch of gravel under someone else's footsteps? Did they see a shadow detach from the even darker wall of pines? We will never know. The criminal approached the car from the driver's side. He didn't demand money or valuables. He didn't utter angry tirades. His silence was more terrible than any words. He simply raised a weapon, a .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol, and shot David Faraday in the head. One bullet, precisely, coldly, almost like at a shooting range. This was not a shot in a fit of rage. It was an execution. Then he shifted the barrel to Betty Lou. The girl, gripped by horror, instinctively tried to flee. She jumped out of the car and ran. She managed to run almost 9 meters. The prints of her shoes on the damp ground would later become silent testimony to her last, desperate impulse for life. The killer shot her in the back. 5 times. He fired until the pistol jammed. Then he simply turned around and dissolved into the fog and darkness, leaving behind silence, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine, and 2 bodies in which life still faintly lingered. They were discovered around 11 p.m. by other teenagers who had come to the same spot. At first, they thought their friends were asleep, but the headlights revealed the terrible truth. The arriving police were completely baffled. Motive, robbery, was ruled out. Wallets and valuables were untouched. Personal revenge. Neither David nor Betty Lou had enemies capable of such a thing. It looked like a senseless, almost ritual slaughter. Investigators collected evidence shell casings, footprints. But that night, they did not find the main thing meaning. The case gradually moved to the folder of unsolved crimes. Local newspapers printed a couple of short articles, and the world seemed to move on. But for someone, this was only the first chapter. A dress rehearsal. The real premiere, loud and brazen, was scheduled for Independence Day, July 4, 1969. America was celebrating its 193rd anniversary. The air was filled with the smell of grilled meat, gunpowder, and carefree joy. The war in Vietnam seemed so distant. On this day, everyone was simply American in Vallejo, at a park on the lake shore known as Blue Rock Springs. It was especially crowded. Here, around 10 p.m., another couple arrived. 22-year-old Darlene Farron and 19-year-old Michael Majo. Their story was more complicated. Darlene was a married woman living separately from her husband, sociable and full of life. Michael, a calm, somewhat shy guy, for whom this was one of his first dates. They parked a brown Chevrolet Impala and talked, looking at the dark waters of the lake, reflecting the last flashes of the festive fireworks. They were not alone. Other cars with couples were parked nearby. Nothing foreshadowed trouble. The atmosphere was relaxed, safe. Around 11:55 p.m., another car stopped behind them. Its headlights brightly illuminated the interior of the Impala, revealing the silhouettes of the two people inside. Michael later recalled thinking it was the police, or maybe acquaintances playing a joke. A man got out of the car. He was carrying a large, powerful flashlight, its beam blinding. He approached their car from the passenger side. Michael, still not grasping the seriousness of the situation, rolled down the window. And again, not a word. No shout, no demand. Only the sharp, deafening, animal sound of gunshots, bursting into the night that still held the echo of festive salutes. The man fired through the open window. He aimed precisely. The first bullets hit Darlene. Michael Majo instantly realized this was not a joke. He shouted to Darlene, "Get down," and tried to take cover on the seat himself, but the car's interior became a trap. The killer methodically, without haste, shot at both of them. 5 bullets found their mark in Darlene, 2 in Michael. He fired with such force and at such close range that one of the bullets, piercing the metal of the door, fell onto the seat, dripping with Darlene's blood, tangible evidence of inhuman cruelty. Then the shooting stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The killer, just as silently returned to his car, turned around and drove off into the night. The entire event took less than a minute. Michael Majo, despite terrible wounds, remained conscious. He heard Darlene wheezing, trying to breathe. He tried to reach the ignition keys to drive away, but his body wouldn't obey. Then, gathering his last strength, he opened the door and, bleeding, crawled on the ground towards another car parked nearby to ask for help. He was noticed. Panic erupted, screams, crying. Someone rushed to a nearby house to call the police. At 0:05, just minutes after the shooting, the first call came into the Vallejo police dispatcher's console. But this was not a call for help from witnesses. It was a call from the killer himself. "I want to report a murder." No, a double murder. They are lying on Blue Rock Springs Road, east of Highway 37. The car is a brown Chevrolet. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. "I am the one who did it." He hung up. This call was not just bragging. It was a declaration of war, a bid for attention. He didn't just kill, he demanded to be known. And for him to be known, he stepped out of the shadows and challenged the entire law enforcement system. Darlene Ferrin died on the way to the hospital. Michael Mage survived, miraculously. He became the first person to see Zodiac's face and live. His descriptions: a white male, 26-30 years old, stocky, with short, light hair, formed the basis of the first composite sketch of the ghost. But the real signature, the very cryptonym that would forever enter history, would appear a little later, a month later, when 3 identical envelopes would arrive at the editorial offices of 3 major San Francisco newspapers. Envelopes with a time bomb, filled with ink, paper, and impenetrable evil. Until now, Zodiac had been a local phenomenon. A ghost whose breath was felt only on the foggy roads of Vallejo. But on the last day of July 1969, he made a qualitative leap. He staged his own birth as a media persona, as a brand of horror. If the first shots were his baptism by fire, then the mailing of the letters was his baptism by ink. He understood something that marketers and PR people would only grasp decades later. To achieve immortality, you must become not just a man, but an idea. And ideas, like viruses, spread through the media, and he created the perfect packaging for his idea: a mystery. A combination of frank, soul-chilling narcissism and complex, almost mathematical intellect. This combination generated the hypnotic horror that has not dissipated to this day. July 31, 1969. In the editorial offices of 3 major newspapers, the San Francisco Examiner, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the Vallejo Times-Herald, unremarkable envelopes were opened. Inside was not a letter in the usual sense. It was a manifesto. It was a challenge. Each letter contained 3 sheets of paper, written in a neat, clear, almost calligraphic handwriting. One of these sheets was not just text, it was a cipher. 408 mysterious symbols unfamiliar to most people, divided into 3 equal parts, one for each newspaper. This was not just a code, it was a test of endurance for the authorities and of intellect for society. But the real-time bomb was the accompanying text. It began with a phrase that would become his trademark, his motto, his eternal contempt for all things human. This is the Zodiac speaking. I am the murderer of the taxi driver over by Washington Cent and Maple sent last Christmas. I also killed the teenagers last 4th of July. Good luck with the cracking. I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all. It gives me the most thrilling experience to know that after I have killed, I will be reborn in paradise, and all I have killed will become my slaves. I will not give you my name, because you will try to slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife. P.S. The code contains my name. This was a text written with cold, calculated theatricality. It didn't just report crimes, it depicted them, reveling in its own narrative. The phrase, "they died like rabbits," was not a statement of fact, but a humiliation of the victims, stripping them of human dignity. The mention of slaves in the afterlife revealed not just cruelty, but a deeply rooted, almost mythological vanity, a mania of grandeur taken to the absolute. He positioned himself not as a criminal, but as a super being, a god deciding fates. But the most brilliant move from a PR standpoint was the postscript. The code contains my name. This was a lie, but a genius one. It transformed a faceless killer into a man with a name that could be discovered. It involved every reader in the game, made them an accomplice, forced them to puzzle not over who he is, but what his name is. This created an illusion of closeness, of intimacy with the monster. The editorial offices faced a difficult ethical choice. To publish meant to become the killer's mouthpiece, give him the fame he craved, and provoke panic. Not to publish meant to hide information about an extremely dangerous criminal from the public and deprive them of a chance to help. After consultations with the police, the decision was made to publish. The San Francisco Chronicle printed the letter, and it's part of the cipher. It was a challenge thrown down to the whole world. Help us catch this monster. And the world responded. The 408-symbol cipher became a national puzzle. It was attempted by mathematicians from Stanford, cryptographers from the CIA and NSA, linguistics professors, and amateur puzzle enthusiasts across the country. It was the first crowdsourced manhunt for a serial killer in history. The Zodiac cipher resisted standard decryption methods. It was not a simple substitution cipher where one letter is always replaced by one symbol. Zodiac used a more complex homophonic substitution, where one letter could be encoded by several different symbols to hide the frequency of letter usage in English. This spoke of his high cryptographic literacy. The police and FBI struggled with the cipher for several days without result. But the real breakthrough was made not by professional codebreakers with their powerful, by the standards of the time computers, but by an ordinary married couple from Salt Lake City, Donald and Betty Harden. Donald was a history teacher, Betty a former English teacher. They sat down at their kitchen table, armed with pens, paper, and old-fashioned ingenuity. Their method was genius in its simplicity. They assumed that Zodiac, like most people starting a message, might have used the word I. They found the most frequent symbol in the cipher and assigned it the letter I. Then they looked for frequently occurring combinations of symbols that could correspond to the articles THE or AND. They worked nights, sorting through options like assembling a complex jigsaw puzzle. It was a Herculean labor, reminiscent of deciphering ancient manuscripts, and they succeeded. Just a few days after publication, on August 5, 1969, the Hardens sent the decryption to the FBI. The agents checked it, and it was correct. The whole world held its breath in anticipation. What name, what terrible revelation was hidden in the cipher? And this is what was there. I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest, because man is the most dangerous animal of all. To kill something gives me the most thrilling experience. It is even better than getting your rocks off. With a girl, the best part of it is that when I die, I will be reborn in paradise. And all that I have killed will become MYSLAVES. I will not give you my name, because you will try to SLOI down or stop my collecting of SLAVES for MY afterlife. EBORTMETHHPITI. It was a colossal disappointment, and simultaneously a new level of horror. His name was not there. His message was not information, but pure, concentrated evil. It was a stream of consciousness of a sadist, his intimate philosophy. The mention of getting your rocks off with a girl and slaves in the afterlife painted a portrait of a deeply sick man, obsessed with power and sexual fantasies, whose motivation was rooted not in revenge or greed, but in a refined form of narcissistic psychosis. The decryption did not bring the police closer to catching Zodiac, but it told them much about him. He was intelligent, educated, possessed knowledge of cryptography. He was vain to the point of absurdity, believing in his divine chosenness. And he was a liar. His promise to reveal his name was a deception, part of the game. From this moment on, any word of his could be called into question, And while investigators and psychiatrists analyzed this message, Zodiac, irritated by the quick cracking of his cipher and perhaps feeling outsmarted, was preparing a new strike. This time, he would not shoot from the darkness. This time, he decided to get closer. Closer than anyone could have anticipated. He decided not just to kill. He decided to stage a ritual. Lake Berryessa, located near the city of Napa, was a popular spot for picnics and outdoor recreation. Here, on a small peninsula known as Love Island, two students had come. 22-year-old Cecilia Shepard and 22-year-old Brian Hartnell. They were a long-term couple, intelligent, promising young people. Brian was studying law, Cecilia music. They had spread out a blanket and were enjoying the sun, reading and talking. It was a picture of absolute peace and serenity. Around 4 p.m., their solitude was interrupted by a man. He approached them from behind. So they first heard his footsteps, then his voice. But this was not a man one would suspect of anything bad on such an idyllic day. His appearance was simultaneously comical and chillingly eerie. On his head was a cloth hood, sewn by hand from black fabric, with a large white cross sewn on the front, like that of an executioner or a participant in a medieval religious procession. Dark glasses protruded from under the hood. On his chest hung a kind of wooden medallion. In one hand, he held a pistol, in the other, a long, shiny flashlight on a stand. It all looked like a costume for some absurd play. Brian later recalled that his first thought was, "This is some kind of stupid joke." But the voice under the hood was calm, firm, and promised no good. "I am an escapee from Deer Lodge, Montana, prison," he said. "I need your money and car to go to Mexico." But this was a lie. He needed neither money nor the car. He needed what he had written about in his letters. He needed fun. He needed a ritual. He ordered Brian to tie up Cecilia with a plastic cord he had brought with him. Then he tied up Brian himself, checking the knots for strength, making sure they were immobilized and completely helpless. He uttered a phrase that would be forever etched in Brian's memory. "Guess I'm going to have to stab you people." And then he began. He did not shoot. He stabbed. Multiple, rapid, furious blows to the backs of the lying, bound victims. Cecilia received 24 stab wounds. Brian, who pretended to be dead and held his breath, was stabbed 7 times. The attack was so ferocious that the knife blade bent from striking ribs. Satisfied, the killer walked away. But before that, he did something that was pure malice. The final stroke in his picture. He approached Brian's white Volkswagen Beetle and wrote on the door with a black marker the dates and locations of his crimes. Vallejo, 12 Minutes, 20 Minutes, 68. 7 minus 4 minus 69, sept 27 minus 69 6, 30, by knife. This was his calling card. A report on work done. He was signing his crime, like an artist signs a painting. He wasn't just killing, he was documenting. He was creating an archive of his madness. Brian Hartnell, despite terrible wounds, survived. He managed to crawl to the lake and call for help. His cries were heard by fishermen. Cecilia Shepard died 2 days later in the hospital without regaining consciousness. The attack in broad daylight, in a public place, using a theatrical costume and a bladed weapon. Zodiac was demonstrating a new, frightening level of audacity. He was no longer a shadow in the night. Now he was a stage character who came when he wanted and did what he wanted, surrounding himself with an aura of mystical ritual. And while the police were combing the area around the lake for any lead, a new letter was already on its way to the San Francisco Chronicle. In it, he would proudly tell of the good times at Lake Berryessa. And for the first time, he would send physical evidence, a souvenir, a trophy that was to become the ultimate proof of his power over life and death, a piece of bloodied cloth from Cecilia Shepard's shirt. His next target would not be a deserted beach or a park. His target would be a noisy, neon-lit district in the very heart of San Francisco. Autumn 1969. San Francisco was in a state of undeclared war with a ghost. Police from 2 counties, Napa and Solano, were conducting investigations. The FBI had connected its resources to crack the ciphers, and the editorial offices of newspapers were filled with an atmosphere of nervous anticipation. Everyone was waiting for the next move, and Zodiac did not keep them waiting. His attack at Lake Berryessa was a psychological turning point. He was no longer an anonymous shooter. Now he had a costume, a handwriting, a ritual. He had materialized, taken form, however eerie and carnivalesque. But his next crime would return him to the status of an invisible threat, a shadow that could strike in the very heart of the big city, on a well-lit street, in front of dozens of potential witnesses. He would prove that his power was not limited to deserted outskirts. October 11, 1969, Saturday, around 9:55 p.m. The wealthy, respectable Presidio Heights district of San Francisco. The streets here were well lit, the houses expensive, with well-kept facades. The noise and bustle of the central quarters did not reach here. An atmosphere of calm and security prevailed, reinforced by the high incomes of the residents. At the corner of Washington and Cherry Streets stood a taxi from the Yellow Cab Company. At the wheel was Paul Stein, 29, father of 2, a part-time student. He had just dropped off his previous passenger and was probably checking a map or making an entry in his log when a man approached his car. The man sat in the passenger seat next to the driver and gave an address, the intersection of Washington Street and Maple Street. It was a short trip, no more than 5 minutes, deeper into the quiet residential area. Nothing foreshadowed trouble. Paul Stein was an experienced driver. He had driven thousands of passengers, just like this one. The car stopped at the indicated location. What happened next, we know only from circumstantial evidence. Probably, a command was given to hand over the money, or perhaps the killer acted immediately. A witness in a house nearby heard a single loud cry, like a shout of surprise or protest. Then 3 quick gunshots. The witness looked out the window and saw a man getting out of the taxi, unhurriedly walking around the car, bending down to the driver's window, performing some actions inside, and then calmly, without running, walking away in the direction of the dark Presidio Park. The street fell silent again. The arriving police found Paul Stein dead in the driver's seat. He had been killed by shots to the head at close range. The bullets were from a 9 pistol, the very one Zodiac had described in his call after the Blue Rock Springs murder. But the strangest thing awaited the investigators outside. On the driver's side door, they found marks that they first took for fingerprints made in blood. But upon closer inspection, it turned out to be something else. Someone, likely the killer himself, had dragged some object across the bloodied surface of the door, leaving clear but unidentifiable marks. Perhaps he was trying to wipe off fingerprints, or perhaps it was another part of his ritual, his strange, perverted signature. But the main mystery of this crime was the composite sketch compiled from the accounts of 3 teenagers. They were nearby and had seen the man getting into Paul Stein's taxi. Their description was surprisingly unanimous and detailed. A man about 45 years old, stocky, with a fleshy face, smooth, combed back dark hair, and glasses with dark frames. He was wearing a dark jacket and dark trousers. This sketch, known as the Stein sketch, would become the most famous and yet the most controversial image of Zodiac. It did not match the earlier descriptions from Michael Majow. Light-haired, 30 years old. This gave rise to theories that Zodiac might not be one person, or that he was able to drastically change his appearance, or that the witnesses had seen the wrong man. The murder of a taxi driver in downtown San Francisco caused unprecedented panic. Now no one felt safe. If he could kill here, in such a place, at such a time, then where was it safe? The fear that had once been the property of the suburbs had spread to the metropolis. Zodiac, like an experienced playwright, understood that after the climax, there must be a denouement that sums things up. On October 13, just 2 days after Stein's murder, a new letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle. It was shorter than the previous ones, but in its emotional force and cynicism, it surpassed everything he had written before. This is the Zodiac speaking. I am the murderer of the taxi driver over by Washington Scent and Maple sent last night. To prove this, here is a blood-stained piece of his shirt. I am the same man who did in the People in the North Bay area. The SF police could have caught me last night if they had searched the park properly, instead of holding road races with their motorcycles, seeing who could make the most noise. The car drivers should have just parked their cars and sat there quietly waiting for me to come out of cover. School children make nice targets. I think I shall wipe out a school bus some morning, just shoot out the front tire, and then pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out. The letter was filled with contempt for his victims. He humiliated them even after death. It was a classic example of victim blaming, taken to a sadistic absurdity. He boasted not only of his actions, but also of his contempt for human weakness. But the most terrifying element of the package was not the letter. Attached to the envelope was a small, neatly torn piece of cloth. When it was extracted and unfolded, it became clear. It was a swatch from a gray shirt with black and white stripes. On it were dark, brownish stains. Dried blood. Laboratory analysis confirmed the worst. The fabric perfectly matched the fabric of the shirt Cecilia Shepard was killed in. Zodiac had not simply kept this souvenir. He had sent it to the newspaper, like a hunter sending a trophy skin. It was an act of absolute, total desecration. He demonstrated that his power extended not only to the lives of his victims, but also to their deaths, to their memory. He could take a piece of their clothing, soaked in their blood, and use it as a tool to intimidate an entire society. This act caused shock even among seasoned journalists and detectives. The cynicism with which he handled evidence was unprecedented. The police realized they were dealing not just with a maniac, but with a man who derived sadistic pleasure from the entire cycle of violence, from planning to committing the crime and the subsequent public mockery of its results. Not satisfied with one bloody trophy, Zodiac attached another gift to his message. A new cipher, this time consisting of 340 symbols. This was the famous Z-340 cipher. In his letter, he claimed that this cipher contained his name and address. But taught by the bitter experience with the first cipher, the investigators treated this with great skepticism. And they were right. The Z-340 cipher proved incredibly difficult. It used various encryption methods, including symbol transpositions and the same homophonic principle. Its structure was cunning and convoluted. Dozens of the best cryptographers from the FBI, CIA, NSA, and military intelligence worked on it for years. Unsuccessfully, Z-340 became a symbol of Zodiac's elusiveness. It hung like a sword of Damocles over the investigation, a constant reminder that the solution might be so close, yet unattainable. This cipher would not be cracked for over 50 years, only adding fuel to the fire of myths and theories surrounding his identity. But Zodiac was not going to stop at ciphers and souvenirs. He decided to raise the stakes. On November 8, 1969, a letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle that made not only San Francisco, but the entire country shudder. This is the Zodiac speaking. I have changed my mind about the school bus. It shall be a large one. I will have a rifle with a scope. The children will all be standing in line, and I will pick them off one by one. The threat to blow up or shoot a school bus was a nightmare for any parent and any law enforcement agency. This was a qualitatively new level of terror. Zodiac was moving from targeted, albeit horrific, murders to the threat of mass slaughter. He was playing on the most basic, deepest fears of society. In response, the San Francisco police and those of neighboring cities implemented unprecedented security measures. Patrol cars escorted school buses. Routes were changed. Drivers and teachers were instructed on what to do in case of an attack. Parents panicked and refused to send their children to school. The entire region lived in a state of siege. And once again, Zodiac demonstrated his mastery as a manipulator. He created a situation where the threat itself, the fear of a possible event, caused more harm and chaos than the actual crime. He terrorized millions without even pulling the trigger. On October 20, 1969, even before the bus threat, Zodiac made one of his most mysterious and irritating moves. He called the Oakland police and stated that he would only speak to one of two of the country's most famous lawyers, Melvin Belly or F. Lee Bailey. Why? We can only guess. Perhaps he wanted legal advice. Perhaps it was another mockery of the system. But the main surprise was yet to come. On December 14 of the same year, a letter arrived in the editorial office in which Zodiac reported that he had planted a bomb and attached a diagram for its deactivation. A diagram resembling a drawing of a homemade explosive device was indeed attached to the letter. He demanded that his letter and the diagram be printed on the front page of the newspaper. Otherwise, he would activate the bomb. Explosives experts, having studied the diagram, concluded that the device if assembled according to this drawing, would not work. It was non-functional. This could mean two things. Either Zodiac was incompetent in pyrotechnics, or it was another psychological attack designed to demonstrate his technical prowess and keep society on edge. But the most famous element of this message was the so-called Mount Diablo map. Zodiac drew a diagram and claimed that he had buried explosives on the slope of this mountain. The map showed landmarks and coordinates, but they were encrypted using strange symbols resembling zodiac signs and astronomical symbols. He wrote that this bomb would be detonated at the next full moon, and to find it, one needed to decipher the map. It was a treasure hunt in the spirit of pirate lore. The police, FBI, and an army of amateur treasure hunters mounted a real hunt on Mount Diablo. The area was combed length and breadth. No bomb was found. Most likely, it was never there. But the game itself, the thrill of the search, the involvement of thousands of people in solving his personal quest, all this played into Zodiac's hands. He had fooled everyone again, forcing them to spend enormous resources searching for a non-existent threat. By the end of 1969, Zodiac had reached the peak of his influence. He held an entire region in fear. His name was constantly on the front pages. His ciphers could not be cracked by the best minds in the country. He was the king of media space, a ghost everyone feared, but no one could catch. But any empire, even an empire of fear, sooner or later faces a crisis. For Zodiac, this crisis was the growing pressure from the police, the emergence of specific suspects, and his own increasingly confused hand. The Zodiac investigation is not a linear detective story with a clear resolution. It is a labyrinth whose walls are made of thousands of testimonies, hundreds of pieces of evidence, dozens of composite sketches, and psychological profiles. And at the center of this labyrinth, not one minotaur, but several. Shadows cast by different people, each of whom at some point seemed to investigators to be the one and only ghost. By the early 1970s, Zodiac's aura of omnipotence began to crack. Letters came less frequently, their tone becoming sometimes grumpy, sometimes hysterical. Threats remained threats, not actions, but the police were no closer to an arrest than on the day of the first letter. They were mired in a swamp of assumptions, coincidences, and dead ends. This part of the story is not about brilliant detective work, but about meticulous, exhausting labor, about broken destinies and names that would forever remain under the shadow of suspicion. The investigators from the Zodiac Task Force detectives Dave Toskai and Bill Armstrong from San Francisco and Ken Narlow from Vallejo reviewed thousands of files, but several names surfaced again and again, acquiring flesh through evidence, rumors, and strange coincidences. Arthur Lee Allen. This name became synonymous with the Zodiac case. If the investigation had a prime suspect number one, it would be him. There was more evidence against him than against anyone else. Appearance. He bore a striking resemblance to the composite sketch made from the descriptions of the teenagers who saw the man getting into Paul Stein's taxi, stocky, with a fleshy face, wearing glasses. Clothing. He owned a watch of the Meadowlark brand, identical to the one whose bracelet Zodiac tore from Paul Stein's wrist. There was a mark on his wrist from a watch strap that he could not explain. Weapon. During a search, a .22 caliber pistol was found on him, the very caliber used in the first attacks. The ammunition for it matched the shell casings found on Lake Herman Road. Behavior and past. Allen had extensive knowledge of cryptography and weapons. He had served time in prison for the sexual assault of a child, painting a portrait of a man with deep psychological deviations. He worked in a school, including as a school bus driver, which fit perfectly with his threats. Neighbors and acquaintances described him as a strange man, prone to cruel and sadistic statements. Direct evidence. One of his friends, Don Cheney, stated that Allen had once told him about a plan to kill loving couples and blame a non-existent organization called Zodiac. Another witness claimed to have seen Allen in the Lake Berryessa area on the day of the murder. It seemed like everything fit, but there was one critically important failure: fingerprints and handwriting. Arthur Lee Allen's fingerprints did not match the partial prints found on Paul Stein's taxi. Handwriting analysis, conducted by the best experts, yielded inconclusive or negative results. He was not ruled out, but they could not build an irrefutable case against him. He remained a shadow hanging over the case forever. Richard Gaykowski. If Allen was the suspect based on hot evidence, Gaykowski became the main figure as a result of years of journalistic investigation by Robert Graysmith, whose book formed the basis of the famous film. There was less evidence against him, but it was strikingly precise. Handwriting. Gaykowski's handwriting was considered one of the closest to Zodiac's. Experts noted similarities in slant, pressure, and the formation of individual letters. Cryptography. He was a mathematician and physicist who worked in the field of radar, suggesting a deep understanding of complex ciphers and codes. Biography. Gaykowski was born and raised precisely in the areas where Zodiac operated. He served in the Navy and might have been familiar with the coordinate system used on the Mount Diablo map. He had a head injury in childhood that could have affected his psyche. Appearance: he was light-haired and stocky, matching Michael Majau's early descriptions. However, there were contradictions here too. His DNA, extracted from the envelopes of Zodiac's letters, did not match the DNA found on the stamps. Furthermore, he had an alibi for some of the key crimes, which, however, was disputed. Gaykowski died in 2004 without ever admitting his guilt. Other shadows, other individuals also came into the police's view. Lawrence Kane, a former Marine with a propensity for violence, whose wife identified Zodiac's handwriting as her husband's. Ross Sullivan, a mentally unstable man who worked in a library and resembled the Stein sketch. Jack Terrence, an aviation mechanic with a criminal past, suspected of hijacking an airplane. Each of them was a kind of puzzle in which some pieces perfectly fit the portrait of Zodiac, but others decidedly did not. The investigation turned into a giant, exhausting game of evidence for and evidence against. And with each year, the chances of winning this game dwindled. Behind the facade of newspaper headlines and public statements, an invisible war of attrition was being waged. The people who led this case paid a high personal price for it. Detective Dave Toskai of the San Francisco Police Department became one of the main faces in the hunt for Zodiac. He was obsessed with this case. His desk was piled high with folders, the walls covered with maps, ciphers, and composite sketches. He woke up and fell asleep thinking about Zodiac. He personally answered hundreds of calls from volunteer assistants and mentally ill people who confessed to the crimes. This work drained him. Toskai was a man of action, and the Zodiac case was like fighting a shadow you strike, but the opponent is never there. Over time, this obsession began to affect his health and relationships with colleagues. Detective Bill Armstrong, Toskai's partner, was his opposite: calm, methodical, analytical. If Toskai was a hammer, Armstrong was a scalpel. He spent hours over documents, building logical chains, checking and rechecking every detail. Their tandem was a powerful force, but even their combined efforts were not enough. The labyrinth was too vast. Ken Narlow, a detective from the Solano County Sheriff's Office, led the investigation into the first murders in Vallejo. He was a local cop who encountered a crime of unprecedented scale. It was Narlow who had been working on the Arthur Lee Allen case from the very beginning. He was convinced of his involvement, but he constantly lacked the resources and the final, ironclad evidence for an arrest. These men became hostages of the case. They could not close it, could not leave it. It became their personal cross, their failure, which haunted them until the end of their careers and lives. They saw their colleagues retire, other cases solved, and their personal war with the ghost remained eternal. By 1972, Zodiac's activity began to decline. His letters, which had once been frequent and full of rage and vanity, came less and less often. Their tone changed. Notes of irritation appeared in them, resentment that he was no longer feared as before, that the police were allegedly forging his letters. In January 1974, a letter arrived that many consider the last genuine message from Zodiac. It was addressed to the San Francisco Chronicle and began with a complaint. "Dear editor, this is the Zodiac speaking. I am in control of all things. If I do not see this note in your paper, I will do something nasty. I have become very upset with the police for their fabrications about me. I shall no longer announce to anyone when I commit my murders. They shall look like routine robberies, killings of anger, and a few fake accidents, etc. The police shall never catch me because I have been too clever for them." He threatened to make children wear his symbol on their clothes. Otherwise, he would do something terrible to them. But the threat no longer sounded as convincing as before. It was like the grumbling of an old man who realizes the world has stopped fearing him. In 1978, another short letter was received in which he sarcastically commented on the film The Exorcist in relation to himself, and then silence. Zodiac's silence gave rise to no fewer theories than his crimes. He died. The most likely version, perhaps from illness, an accident, or he was killed in the course of another crime. He was arrested for another crime and was serving time under a different name, not being identified as Zodiac. He stopped voluntarily. The mental illness may have entered a phase of remission, or he simply lost interest in his game. Having satisfied his vanity, he was afraid of being caught. The pressure from the police, despite the lack of an arrest, may have forced him to be more cautious, and in the end, to simply stop. Whatever the reason, the ghost voluntarily left the stage he himself had created, but his departure did not bring relief. He left behind a vacuum filled with unanswered questions. While the police tried to recover from the defeat, and the victims' families from their unending pain, something strange began to happen to Zodiac. He began to die as a man and be reborn as a myth. His story, perfectly packaged by himself, turned out to be a ready-made plot for mass culture. He had a catchy pseudonym, a theatrical image, an intellectual challenge in the form of ciphers and maps. He was the perfect anti-hero. Books. The first journalistic investigations, such as Robert Graysmith's book Zodiac, became bestsellers. They not only informed the public, but also cemented certain versions of events and images of suspects in the mass consciousness. Cinema. In 1971, the the film Dirty Harry was released, whose main villain, Scorpio, was modeled on Zodiac. This was the first, but far from the last, appearance of the ghost on screen. Later, both documentary and feature films would be released, the most famous of which, Zodiac by David Fincher, 2007, would become the benchmark in the genre. Conspiracy theories, the police's inability to name a name, gave rise to countless theories. Zodiac was declared to be Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, James Holmes, the Colorado shooter, and even one of the Manson family members. His ciphers became the holy grail for crypto enthusiasts around the world. The internet. With the advent of the World Wide Web, the Zodiac case found a second wind. Dozens of websites, forums, and social media communities were dedicated to solving his mystery. Enthusiasts from all over the world conducted their own investigations, put forward new versions, and tried to crack the remaining ciphers. The investigation became truly crowdsourced. Zodiac, in the end, achieved his goal. He gained the immortal fame he so craved, but it was the fame of a vampire. He lived in the dark corners of the collective consciousness, in the whispers on forums, in the frames of newsreels, in the shiver that runs down one's spine at the mere mention of his name. He ceased to be a killer and became an archetype, a symbol of unpunished evil, an elusive nightmare, and the triumph of myth over reality. And in the quiet offices of retired detectives and in the archives of police stations, folders gathered dust. They contained photographs of smiling teenagers, crime scene diagrams, cryptograms, and composite sketches. And the most terrible thing in these folders was not the confessions of a love for killing or the threats to blow up a bus. The most terrible things were the simple, unanswered questions written in the margins of the report sheets. Who? Why? Where is he now? And the silence in response. The silence that lasted for decades was deceptive. While the Zodiac case files gathered dust in the archives, and the names of Toskai, Armstrong, and Allen became part of history, history itself did not stand still. It moved slowly but inexorably forward, driven by two new forces: the boundless perseverance of civilian enthusiasts and the ruthless precision of modern science. The labyrinth that the best detectives of their time could not navigate began to slowly reveal its secrets to the persistence of thousands of anonymous researchers around the world. The internet erased the boundaries between professional investigation and amateur sleuthing. Forums dedicated to the Zodiac case turned into virtual operational headquarters. Every piece of evidence, every letter, every scrap of information, scanned in high resolution, was posted there. It was also where dozens of new theories were born and died, and it was in this digital environment that an event awaited for 51 years took place. December 2020. A group of enthusiast cryptographers called the Zodiac killer ciphers, using their own software and supercomputers provided by one of the participants, finally cracked the Z-340 cipher. The world, holding its breath, awaited a sensation, awaited a name, an address, a terrible confession. But Zodiac, even after half a century, remained true to himself. He had lied again. The deciphered message contained no name, no threats, no rantings about slaves in the afterlife. It was a disjointed, almost absurd set of phrases. I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. That wasn't me on the TV show, which brings up a point about me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber, because it will send me to paradise all the sooner, because I now have enough slaves to work for me, where all the other have nothing. When they get to heaven they are weak and run down from all the power. They will be mine, the slaves, all mine. In heaven I am in control of all things, because I am the one who lives in heaven, and you are the one who lives in hell. This was not the solution. It was an echo of that very 1969 manifesto. The cipher turned out not to be a key to his identity, but another mirror reflecting his sick, grandeur-filled ego. The main outcome of this decryption was not new knowledge, but the final understanding. Zodiac never intended to reveal himself. His entire game with ciphers was one big, sophisticated trolling. But if cryptography had reached a dead end, another, much more impartial force took the stage: genetics. In 2002, investigators extracted DNA particles from the back of the stamps and envelopes of Zodiac's letters. This DNA became the holy grail for a new generation of hunters. In 2018, by analogy with the high-profile capture of the Golden State Killer through DNA genealogy, a private investigative group led by a former investigator, Ken Basler, announced that they had identified a new prime suspect. He was Gary Francis Post, a man whose life was marked by dark spots. Born in 1942, he was a U.S. Navy veteran who served on an aircraft carrier, which could potentially have given him knowledge of the coordinates used on the Mount Diablo map. After service, he worked as an electrician, had a propensity for violence, was arrested for possessing explosives, and was accused of rape. His first wife reported that he was obsessed with the Zodiac story and even threatened her, saying, "I'll do to you what the Zodiac did to those people." Externally, he bore a resemblance to some of the composite sketches, but as with Arthur Lee Allen, the conclusive proof, a direct DNA match, remains elusive. The DNA extracted from the envelopes was partial, contaminated, and according to some reports, could have belonged not to Zodiac himself, but to someone from the Postal Service or the editorial office. The authorities have not officially confirmed Post's involvement, and he died in 2018 without ever being publicly charged. So, where are we today? The Zodiac case remains open. It is like an unhealed wound on the body of American criminology. It is no longer an active, hot investigation, but it is periodically reopened in the hope that new technologies will give old evidence a new voice. The story of Zodiac is not a detective story. It is a parable. It is not about how a crime is solved, but about how a mystery can outlive its creators, its investigators, and even the era in which it was born. It is about the nature of fear, which, when packaged in a catchy media image, can become immortal. It is about how one vanity, raised to the absolute, can poison the well of public peace for decades. He wanted to be remembered, and he achieved his goal. But his legacy is not fame, but a shadow, not an answer, but an eternal question. He inscribed his name, fictitious, but no less significant, not in history textbooks, but in the darkest corner of our collective imagination. And as long as someone somewhere is peering into the intricate symbols of his ciphers or studying yellowed photographs, his game, even though it ended in silence, still continues.